Hello, welcome to Eurosiberia. Today's guest is Alexander Wolf-Hetze. Hello, Alexander, how are you?
Well, Constantine, it's nice to see you again. Thank you for inviting me on your show, and I'm happy to talk about my book today. I guess that's what we'll do.
Yes. Can you show the book real quick? Yes. Globus Horribilis. Alexander, can you tell us a bit about the title of the book? Why is it called Globus Horribilis?
Well, it's actually a scientific expression, translation of a term from the Manichaean tradition, holos. So, in the time of Mani, there was another religion in Iran, and that religion had another concept of time, concept of cosmology. Traditionalists among us will know what I'm talking about. And in their perception of time, their perception of cosmology, they were assuming that at the end of this cycle of time, the world would be reduced to cinders, literally. So there would be something left of the Earth. The Earth would not be replaced by some kind of a magical place, not by some paradise version of it, not by some renewed Earth, but it would be reduced to a cinder Earth, a globus horribilis translated, that is inhabited only by whatever evil forces were on the earth, and all the good that was on the earth would be taken away from it or corrupted. And the end state of the earth in the Manichaean tradition was the bolos. So that is actually a reference to that cosmological concept, the title. I like to thank, by the way, our, I think, quite talented illustrator of books. He has made Thor Westman of Arktos. He has actually created this beautiful cover quite successfully, I think, using a painting, but his own imagination to fill it up.
Yes, I completely agree. So, regarding the title, do you think that our civilization or the world in general today is heading in the same direction?
Well, I have been writing for Arktos now quite some while, articles, but essays, but also books. This is the third book that I've published with Arktos. The first is Albarosa, second is Lupus Nigra, and this is the last one, Globus Horribilis. So it's a Latin title trilogy. And there is some kind of a system in the way I conceive these books. The first one is a series of traditionalist considerations, essays. The second, a series of archeofuturist essays. And the last one, I call it Futuro-fundamentalist essays. And they describe a certain process that we are witnessing in the West, especially. A change of civilization, a change of our human condition in the West also. The first stage of that book project that I had, it was to describe the crisis of the West, that is known to traditionalists since René Guénon, of course, in purely traditionalist terms. So it's kind of a diagnosis. The second part, book, the Rubens Nigra book, it is meant to give an, an insight to the transition process, the final transition process, the event horizon process of Western civilization, losing itself, changing over into a new state. And the last book, this Globus Horribilis, it is to describe the perspectives facing the West afterwards. So I'm not talking about global civilization. That would be too much of a stretch. It's a book project meant to give a diagnosis of Western civilization. And the end state, it's, as they said, Globus Horribilis, it means the lot of everything good, as good was defined in the West. And its inversion to the opposite values, to an opposite value system.
Exactly. Do you consider Western civilization?
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
What exactly do you consider Western civilization?
Well, let's say the combination of classical culture, classical civilization, with Christian civilization, the omagam that we have been living in Europe since, let's say, the year 500. So I have a quite classical take on it, a Spenglerian take in a certain way. The Western civilization as such is recognizable by certain features. So it has its own character, it has its own development. If you look from a macro historical perspective, which I always do because I've been, my specialty is of course astrology, the study of ancient Near East. So you're trained to look at great perspectives, great time spans and developmental processes that take place over hundreds and mostly even thousands of years. So looking at Western civilization in that way, Western civilization appears as a continuation, but only to up to a certain point. And I think that point, the cutoff point of that civilization has been reached. We are actually living in a very interesting time. So the Chinese saying applies to us. We are living in interesting times, and we can actually see, this is the contention of my book, the final stages of Western civilization now. And that is interesting because it allows us to put our own background, our own history, in a very large, to compare it and to relativize it, to have a view over it that is quite unique, to be able to look at it as from an outside point of view, which of course is given to very few people in very few civilizations.
So, which parts of the world would you include as being Western civilization?
Well, that's quite comparable to ask about, for example, Greek civilization, the one that preceded classical civilization that preceded us. So you could say that the heartland of Greece, it was occupied in the Eastern Mediterranean, the north side especially, but it spread, right? It's known to have spread all the way to Bactria, to India, in the time of Alexander the Great, and influences of it have even filtered through further. So the same applies to Western civilization. Western civilization has a heartland. The heartland, of course, being, let's say, Central Europe, Western Europe, but spreading out from there to the overseas, what we call now Anglosphere and other settlement colonies. But the influence in those overseas areas is much more ephemeral. So like Greek civilization did not penetrate very deep into the soil, much further east than Anatolia. It is the same way Western civilization has its roots in Europe and cannot penetrate very deep into the soil in other areas of the world. At least that's my contention. I think there is such a thing as American civilization, but it's not typically European. It has some European aspects to it. But I think for me, Western civilization, it is a European civilization of the Occident, the Abendland.
So some people say that the West is the enemy of Europe. Would you agree with this statement?
A very interesting talk. You can have an interesting talk about this topic because, of course, the West, what we call now the West, is associated with power, is associated with a dominant hegemonial cultural and political system, which is not necessarily European in any sense of the word. It finds its roots in Europe, at least in some of its thinking systems, in some of its power structures, but it's not any longer typically Western. So I've also dedicated a part of my book, Globus Horribilis, to an analysis of what comes out of Europe and becomes Western. So I call that from the West, the darkness. So ab occidente tenebrae. And that is, of course, opposed to the old saying of ex oriente lux, from the east comes the light. So the West is exactly what it says. It is the land in which the sun sets, in which the light disappears. And the values that are now Western, they are actually inverted versions of Western values, of European values before. So what we now see and now call the West, in my view, it is not a representative of Europe. It is not representative of the European tradition. Rather, they relate themselves, the West relates itself to Europe as an inversion. That's how I look at it.
So are you generally pessimistic or more optimistic? Because earlier you mentioned that you subscribe to the perspective of Oswald Spengler, and Spengler wrote a book called The Decline of the West, and he believed that civilizations are like organisms, basically. They are born, they mature, they grow old, and eventually they die. And he believed that the West is already in the dying stage. Yes, because he believed that originally the West was a great culture, but it had then degenerated into a civilization. Yes, because Spengler differentiated between culture and civilization. So the last stage of this organism is always the civilizational stage. And in case of the West, according to Spengler, we have entered the Faustian age, right? Where the West always wants to expand further and further. It is a sort of overexpansion, while at the same time, it is rotting from within. And Spengler viewed this as inevitable, yes, because like everything else in the universe, civilizations have to die, like all organisms have to die. And then in its place, something new will be born and grow, basically. So in your view, do you think that the West is basically doomed to perish, or do you think it's salvageable? Or do you think after the West is dead, something new will come in its place?
Well, my approach has been throughout these three books, the traditionalist approach. So I have taken the worldview of René Guénon and to a certain extent Julius Evola, applied them to our present condition and applied them to what you would call the culture civilization model of Spengler. So I've looked at this whole issue through traditionalist lens. And that also applies to that last book that I now just wrote, the Globus Horribilis. So applying that traditionalist perspective, you can have an interesting improvement on Spengler, I would say. Because Spengler, he describes what you said, the process of decay and transformation. But if you superimpose the traditionalist perspective on this, it fits in, actually even quite mathematically well, it fits in to the traditionalist cosmology model developed by René Guénon, which stipulates that as time progresses, as a cycle, an historical cycle, cosmological cycle progresses, its time speeds up. So the first part of it is longer than the second part, and so on. The last part is the shortest part. So that also applies to the Vedic perspective. So in the Vedic perspective, the Kali Yuga is the shortest of the time spans, the epochs. So if you apply this model to the European civilization and its change into the West, into what is now the West, you can actually say that there's only a very short time span left for the Western, for what is now called the West. Events have sped up. We have all noticed that the last years. The Great Reset has seen events happen at a very rapid rate. So the old Lenin saying, some decades happen in weeks, has applied here. Developments have taken on a speed that previously was almost inconceivable. And I think this is the final stage of Western civilization. So what I would consider the last stage of European cycle has now ended. I actually put a date on that. I think it's the 6th of November 2021. I think it's a quite appropriate date because it's something that people can recognize. It's of course the date of the Biden coup, the 6th of January 2021. So the Biden coup came to its fruition on that day, and that actually ended the political life of the West, I think. And it is common to give an end date to civilizations. For example, the Roman Empire, we give a date 476. So we can do that. We can give a date to it. And I think it's quite remarkable that it has happened in the way it did, that it ended overseas. It did not end in the European heartland. It ended in America. So that America actually was the scene of the last events of Western civilization. And I think at that point, the cycle has ended. That's what I think.
Right. So talking about America, you mentioned earlier that you believe that a lot of elements in American society are European, but not all of them. So would you consider America a European country or not?
No. There has been much said about American civilization by Europeans. Europeans have visited it, especially the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, artists, philosophers, great men, people that have been thinking about European civilization, how it applies to America. And what they noticed is that in America, everything that is European that's planted there grows differently, flies differently. Even one observer said, Americans, they start to look differently. Their heads start to grow differently. Their demeanor becomes differently. Their physiognomy changes. And I think that's true. The land influences people. The land that you live in creates you as much as a human creates the land. There can be delay in that. Certain Western European civilization features you can see in America, for example, on the East Coast for some time in the colonial time and slightly thereafter, you can see an almost European civilization, but that I think has disappeared in the 19th century. The last traces of it maybe in the time of Edgar Allan Poe. And I think maybe Lovecraft a bit still, he was in that European tradition looking at America. But I think since that time, the transformation has gone far beyond the European origins. It has taken on its own dynamics. And I don't think that America can be considered a European country. That doesn't mean that the people are not, for a large part, the white people, are not European descended people. But their culture has taken on an entirely different, and I would even say, inverse form in many ways.
Yeah, but couldn't the same be said about the European mainland as well? Because ever since 1945, at least Western Europe has been under the complete control of the United States and has basically ceased to be a sovereign continent that makes its own decision. Like Europe has not been a major global player for almost 80 years, right? So don't you think the decline of Europe itself was already set in motion in 1945?
I think you're right. So America being what it is, having transformed itself into a new civilization form, into something anti-European in many ways, came to rule a large part of Europe. And doing so, it automatically, unavoidably transformed that part of Europe that it had power over. I do believe that there were some outposts in Europe. So if you go to the south, Spain, Portugal, they maintained quite independent, authentic European life forms till quite late, even till the 70s. So Franco and also maybe the Salazar. These were people that were Europeans and kept the European system in place in their countries for some time still. Also, it took some time for the European overseas empires to completely unravel. So Europe maintained some residual presence around the world. That, of course, has ended. And we can say that, I would say, since 1992, the European Union, Europe is certainly not anymore itself. It has been transformed by its occupation by America. So America has also established itself as a power in Europe through the European Union, I think, and through other globalist institutions. And of course, these got a grip also over these residual countries. So even a neutral Ireland fell into the EU. Portugal and Spain the same. And we can see that probably since 1992, there is no more real Europe. The real Europe has disappeared. In the East, it has disappeared under communism. These countries, they were taken over by the East. In the West, it was the same. So we were taken over by America. And I believe that one of our colleagues, Hans Vogel, a Dutch writer, he has written a book out with Arktos, How Europe Became American. This describes the process quite well. It gives a short historical overview of the process. And I think he has argued it to the T. So people can look at that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with you that it was the same in Eastern Europe under communism. Because, well, in Western Europe, under capitalism and under American control, the cultures and traditions were actively undermined and even destroyed. But I think in Eastern Europe, which was under the control of the Soviet Union and communists, I think traditions were mostly kept intact and even cherished to some extent. And I think this is the reason why most East European and even Central European countries are more traditional even today than their Western European counterparts. What do you think?
It is undeniable. I've lived a long time in Eastern Europe myself, that there things are better preserved. So communism, the Soviet regime, of course, functioned like a kind of a fridge. It froze or it mummified peoples, belief systems, cultural habits. Education system was kept intact. Many parts that were compatible with the ruling elite's priorities, they were allowed to subsist. And of course, these were European institutions, European life forms, European values. The families are better preserved in Eastern Europe. Education system is better preserved in Eastern Europe. Ethnicity as such is better preserved. But that doesn't mean that the same dynamics that we see in Western Europe are not also at work there. So many Eastern Europeans also notice that with the coming of the EU to these areas, with the influx of Western values, with the takeover of the economy by Western firms, and of course American-led consumer models, by this also Eastern European culture has disintegrated, often even faster than Western, than it has been the case in the West. The main thing that differentiates at the moment still West and Eastern Europe, of course, is the fact that Eastern Europe has not been subjected to what we call umvolking, so ethnic replacement to the same extent. Not yet. And that is something that I would say it's just a force of inertia by which Eastern Europe still preserves some measure of a European feel, but politically it is entirely under Western control. By the way, I do not consider in this approach Russia and the Orthodox countries in the same category. So for me, they do not fall under the West. They do not fall under the Western European civilization. They have their own dynamics, I think.
So in your book, Globus Horribilis, what do you have to say about the topic of multipolarity?
Well, I've divided the book into 4 parts. The first part, it talks about the Great Reset. It talks about events that have taken place and shaped the fall of the West, as I call it, the 6th of January 2021 as its formal end date. The second part, it talks about alternative views from the East. So how to look at the Western predicament from the Eastern perspective, non-Western European perspective, non-Western perspective. And I have done this by reviewing a number of books in this part, but these reviews are first critical and second place these books in a larger framework, in a traditionalist interpretation framework. So the dynamics of multipolarity are also discussed in the second part of the book, and especially in the chapter dedicated to Professor Savin, Leonid Savin's book, Ordo Pluriversalis. So Ordo Pluriversalis, of course, a Latin name that implies the multipolarity order, the rising multipolarity order. And we have seen this rise that Professor Savin theoretically worked out actually being practically implemented over the last couple of years. So it's very interesting, I think, for readers to look at my review of the book and compare it to the practical events of the last couple of years.
That's very interesting, of course. So what do you have to say about what some Western analysts call the civilizational conflict, like Huntington, right? You have liberal democracy on one hand, and you have what the liberals call authoritarian, repressive regimes that try to go back to a previous order which liberalism thinks had already been overcome. Like Islam, for example, Islamic societies, or you have, well, Hindu nationalism on the rise in India. So
yes. So from the Huntington perspective, a perspective, by the way, that has been discussed extensively and interpreted quite interestingly by our fellow author at Arktos, Jason Georgiani. The Huntington model presupposes that there is such a thing as a Western civilization. So, but I would argue that's not the case. I think the Western European civilization has ended. And what has come into the place, what we call now Western, is something entirely different. It's of an entirely different order. It's not a civilization, it's an anti-civilization, and that also fits to the politics that we see attached to it. So globalism does not state that it represents a certain region of the world or values of a certain region of the world. No, it represents a global governance system and a global value system. So what has come out of the West, globalism, it is an antithesis to any kind of civilization. It is, and of course, it finds itself at odds with any kind of civilization. All other civilizations in the model of Huntington, so Islamic civilization or Indian civilization, of course, they are at odds because they relate, all civilizations, all other civilizations relate as thesis relates itself to the antithesis of this globalist new anti-civilization. I call it an anti-civilization.
So could you please talk a bit about the default prognosis in your book, basically about the devolutionary trajectory of Western-led modernity?
Yes. So, a number of years ago, I wrote a book called Sunset. I wrote that for Cambridge scholars. People can look at it. It describes the practical, uh, political, also geopolitical implications of the traditionalist model developed by René Guénon, with some additions by Evola. So looking at modern history, at practical history through the traditionalist lens. This book, the last that I now wrote with for Arktos, Globus Horribilis, re-evaluates the trajectory that we are on now. So my first book, Sunset, talked about the trajectory till the point of 1914 approximately. And in this book, Globus Horribilis, I included the chapter 10, that reviews the progress, the trajectory till now, till the point of writing, so beginning of this year. And what I found very remarkable is the speed with which events take place. If you look at the Guénon model, it predicts a speeding up of events, and that's exactly what we are seeing. So a race to the bottom in a certain way, and a falling away of, let's say, falling away of the grounding of Western civilization. Western civilization has ended. That means that the protecting outlines of human life, upward and downwards, the literal grounding, the literal economy, the literal protecting systems in place for people are falling away. That applies in the spiritual realm, in the economic realm, in the political realm. It is as if a house doesn't have any more a floor, and it doesn't have a roof, and it doesn't have walls. It is opened up, and it is falling apart. It is not anymore protecting the people that are in it. That alters the people that are in it. So the Westerners, ex-Westerners, people that are left over in the West, find themselves homeless and find themselves subjected to forces beyond their control. They are exposed, so to say, to the elements. And these elements, of course, include, according to René Guénon and other traditionalists, spiritual influences, and not all of them are benign.
Well, thank you. Could you also quickly discuss the Future-fundamentalist approach in your book? Because you talk both about archeofuturism and traditionalism. And I think the general understanding is that archeofuturism, as espoused by Guillaume Faye, and traditionalism, as espoused by René Guénon and Julius Evola, and nowadays by Alexander Dugin, these two approaches, archeofuturism and traditionalism, are generally incompatible. Yes, I mean, I hear this all the time. People saying you can't be both. You can't be archeofuturist and traditionalist, because archeofuturists are basically in favor of progress. They welcome technology, while traditionalists basically take the opposite view, right? They're very critical of technology because they think it estranges people from their humanity. So how can you have an approach that combines both archeofuturism and traditionalism? So what do you have to say about this in your book?
So, of course, taken as in its narrow way, in that narrow sense, in the Guillaume Faye sense, archeofuturism is also a political model. It has perspectives in it that are compatible with certain politics, with certain political views. That is not the case in how I handle archeofuturism. So I adopt this archeofuturism for my own purposes. I use the perspective of traditionalism and archeofuturism only as tools. So I don't espouse them. I find them interesting, and I try to use them as tools to understand events around us. I found traditionalism useful for a macro historical perspective, and I find archeofuturism interesting as an political philosophical system that breaks down conceptual barriers. So I'm using these terms as in a very flexible sense. And they are compatible to the degree that they allow, each allows a view on events that are happening, and some are better explained by archeofuturism, some are better explained by traditionalism. And you talked about future-fundamentalism. Of course, that is the term that I jokingly applied to as a subtitle to Globus Horribilis, which means simply this, that our trajectory, our developmental trajectory that we are on in the area called now the West, is shaped most of all by the future. So we are not, we are cut off from our past. Our civilization has fallen, and we are cut off of our present as well, because people living in a virtual world, in a fake reality to a large extent, or in a constructed reality. And that constructed reality is more like an embryonic form. It is preparing people for something, for a transition. You see that all our Western leaders and all our Western government systems are geared towards a change, towards they are pursuing programs in the future. They are not pursuing reference points in the past. They are all going forward. For example, Agenda 2030 and that kind of thing. So each and every leader, each and every ideological force in the West is geared toward the future. So fundamentalism means nothing else but that the future becomes the absolute guideline for all human action. And I use this in an ironic way in my book because there is, of course, another conception than what our leaders present. Our leaders present progress. They stand for development. But from a traditionalist point of view, this is rather devolution and regress and degeneracy. And the future that traditionalism proposes, projects, for example, in the Guénon model, is not very compatible with the ideal forms that Westerners live towards, that they think they are living towards. Rather, the content of the future is the opposite of human. It is going away from tradition and going away from humanity, because tradition, of course, is the house of being of the human form, the human culture. And this is something that is going to disappear. So that is why transhumanism and all kinds of other trans developments are taking place in the West, in my view.
Right. So, in your opinion, what are some of the main threats facing Europe today, and what can we do to overcome them?
I believe that the most important change that is taking place is in the psyche of the people. So, if people are completely detached from any kind of tradition, they become like empty vessels that can be filled with by other forces. That can be our leaders, but then the question should be asked, if these leaders are guiding these empty vessels, they are detaching European humans away from their tradition, from their existential basis, taking away all the reference points out of their lives. What are they going to put in the place of these old values and old traditional reference points? And I do not think that the leaders, as we see them, at least in public, or as they present themselves through their programs, have anything positive to offer, and they are not even in charge. They are rather factors So operators of a larger system, they're fulfilling a function in a larger developmental system, and this developmental system has its own dynamics, its independent dynamics. So I quote also in my book Nick Land. He says, nothing human will make it out of the near future. That is also, that correctly fits into the traditionalist model of René Guénon.
Right. I suppose we'll have to wait and see what the future really holds for us. So could you tell our audience why it is important for them to read your new book?
The book, first of all, contains an overview of books that are important for the dissident right. So we both come from a group that is generally referred to as the dissident right, although that is changing. The European New Right, you can call it as well. And in my book, I give reviews of certain key publications. Also, I give an overview, a Reader's Digest of key fragments, and I comment them and analyze them that were created during the Great Reset years, so 2020, 2021. Key texts they can find, key analysis they can find a traditionalist take and archeofuturist take on processes that have taken place the last years, and they will find in it finally a prognosis in the traditionalist sense of what is to come next. For this I use both some of my own insights, but also some artistic analysis and also some political philosophical analysis, such as done by our fellow author Jason Giorgiani. I have commented some of his works and taken some of his perspectives and tried to take them one step further and see what lies in wait for European, Western or ex-Western men.
Well, Alexander, thank you very much for being a guest on the show and talking about your new book. And I highly recommend the book and think that our audience who shares our interests will certainly learn a lot from it. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, I'm looking forward to your next book. Do you have any plans yet?
I am not sure there will be time to write it, but if there is, yes, there will be.
All right. So we're all looking forward to it. Thank you and have a nice day.
Thank you. Goodbye.